Greetings, I'm Ken Samples. I am a college professor as well as a scholar at Reasons to Believe, and my topic today is Clear Thinking in a Messy World. That is the title of a new book that I wrote with a colleague named Mark Perez. The title is Clear Thinking in a Messy World. The subtitle is A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. So I'm going to be talking with you about reason and logic and rationality. Many non-Christians tend to think that Christians are emotional feelers rather than critical thinkers. And I don't think that that is the case. I think historically Christians have been very careful thinkers. Many Christian scholars have made contributions to the fields of logic and rationality. But of course, there are Christian churches that sometimes reflect a bit of anti-intellectualism. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a warm church. I like Christians with warm hearts. But I want those warm hearts to also be sharp minds. And I like very much this quote from Jaroslav Pelikan. Pelikan was a historical theologian at Yale Divinity School for probably more than 40 years. Listen to this quotation by Pelikan. He says, "The church is always more than a school, but the church cannot be less than a school." One more time. The church is always more than a school, but the church cannot be less than a school. A church is also many things. It's a place where we come to worship God. It is a place where we fellowship with one another. Sometimes the church serves as a counseling center. What Pelikan says is, of all the things that the church is, it cannot be less than a school. And I'm concerned that in many parts of America and other countries as well, that the Christian churches are less than schools. And by a school, I don't mean kindergarten to 12. I mean a place of thinking, a place of knowledge, a place of learning and study. And so I think it's very important that our churches represent a place where people can continue to learn and to grow. Now, of course, what's interesting too is that Jesus tells us that we should love God with our mind. So let me read Matthew 22:37. And he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind." And so this is really kind of, even though we derive this from the Greek New Testament, what we recognize here is this is a type of Hebrew parallelism. Jesus is really telling us to love God with the whole person, with all of our faculties. Now, Peter says something similar to this. He says in 2 Peter 3:18, he says, "But grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him be glory both now and forever. Amen." Now, one of the beautiful things about studying logic is that it helps you to order your thinking. And my co-author, Mark Perez, gave a funny line. He said, "Ready, fire, aim." Well, that's going to get you into big trouble. If you're ready, fire, aim, you need to aim before you fire. It's out of order. Logic doesn't really teach you to think. It helps you to order your thinking. And so Aristotle defined logic, or the logos in Greek, as ordered thinking. And so I'm sure you think pretty well, but probably like me and everybody else, maybe your thinking can be out of order. It can be kind of sloppy. And that's what logic can really help us in terms of ordering our thought. And of course, one of the most important skills to master, particularly if you intend to share your faith with others, is how to form a logical argument. And what I want to say there is, though it might seem complicated, an argument in logic is really a simple thing. But I think first we have to recognize what an argument in logic is not. An argument in logic does not refer to a verbal fight, a bitter controversy, or a heated disagreement. You can be reasoning very sharply and directly without your jugular vein popping out, without your blood pressure rising, without your face turning red, because a logical argument is not a dispute or a fight. Now, I very much like this definition that comes from Ed Miller. Ed Miller was both a Christian theologian and a philosopher. I used his book, Teaching Philosophy at various colleges. That book is entitled Questions That Matter. Here's his definition of a logical argument. He says, quote, "A real argument is a carefully devised piece of reasoning involving premises, what is reasoned from, a conclusion, what is reasoned to, and an inference, the connection which yields the conclusion from the premises." So 3 parts to an argument. You have to make a claim called the conclusion. You have to back that claim with support, reasons, facts, evidence, called premises. And there must be an inferential link that takes you from the support to the conclusion. So to have an argument, you must make a claim, right? And that's the conclusion. Provide support, those are called the premises. And you must supply the reasoning process. That's called an inference that moves the mind of the reader or listener from the premises to the conclusion. So again, just a summary, 3 essential components of an argument. The claim is your conclusion. That's what you want to prove. That's what you want people to accept. The premises, facts, evidence, and reason, they do the supporting. And then there needs to be that critical inference, the reasoning processes that take you from your premises, your support, to your conclusion. Now let's mention just a little bit about premises. Premises provide support, reasons, evidence, facts for accepting the conclusion. And take a look at that image there. It has a bit of a circular, and that's the conclusion. But notice that the premises support that from all different sides. That's very important, that your premises solidly support all the angles of the argument, so to speak. So to have a good argument, and that would be a sound argument in deductive reasoning or a cogent argument in inductive reasoning, to have a good argument, a viable argument, your premises must at minimum be true. They must also be relevant to your central claim. And 3, they must be adequate to sufficiently support the conclusion. So if one of your premises is false, then your argument's going to crash and burn. Your argument has failed. But if your premises are not pertinent or connected to the conclusion, that's also going to be a serious problem, which is going to make your argument fail. And it needs to be adequately supported in that context. I like this image of a house very much. Think of the roof here as the conclusion, and think of the walls that support the roof as your premises. So if I poke holes in your premises, which would be the walls in this house example, then that roof is going to come crashing down. So we might say this: your conclusion is only as good as the premises that support them. You want your premises to be true. You want your premises to be adequate, to be connected. And so learning what a logical argument is very important. Well, let's now look at a particular argument. This would be a deductive argument, and what characterizes deduction is the focus of coming up with a certain or necessary conclusion. The goal of a deductive argument is to provide a certain conclusion. Well, here is a very famous example of a deductive argument, and it's stated as a syllogism, 2 premises followed by a conclusion. The first premise, all humans are mortal. The second premise, Socrates is human, and therefore my conclusion, number 3, Socrates is mortal. Think of the reasoning here. We start out very broadly, all humans are mortal. Then we move to a particular person, Socrates, and we argue that Socrates is mortal. Well, if all people are mortal, and Socrates is one of those persons, then it follows with necessity that he would himself be mortal. That's deductive reasoning. Now, I can take that argument and also pitch it in an inductive way. By inductive, I really mean I want conclusions that follow probably. Inductive reasoning is characteristic of science. Now, scientists use deductive reasoning, they use inductive reasoning and abductive reasoning, which I'll talk about in a little while. But science is largely an inductive enterprise. So the following serves as a classic example of an inductive argument where if you're successful, you would get a probably true conclusion. So premise number 1 says Socrates is mortal. Premise number 2 says Plato is mortal. Premise number 3 says Aristotle is mortal. Premise number 4 says I'm mortal. Premise number 5 says you're mortal. Then I draw the conclusion, therefore all humans are probably mortal. So the difference between deduction and induction is deduction is trying to prove it with certainty. Induction is trying to make it highly probable. Now let me introduce you to a third type of reasoning. It's called abductive reasoning, and that, instead of having certainty like deduction or probability like induction, the goal there is to make the most plausibly true conclusion. Now I like to use an acronym, and it's the word CLEAR, C-L-E-A-R, and I use that word as an acronym to demonstrate the power and sheer scope of Christianity's explanatory power. It also helps me to remember how I want to present these ideas. So each letter denotes an aspect of reality that all worldviews must account for. So let me present that CLEAR acronym. So you see the C in cosmos, the L in life, the E in ethics, the A in abstractions, the R in religion, so it spells out clear. Well, here is how belief in God, the God of the Bible, and historic Christianity provides the best explanation. Christianity tells us why there is a world at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why the universe had a beginning, why the cosmos is complex and fine-tuned, and why it's intelligible. That is, it can be understood by human reasoning and use of math and logic. In life, human beings have consciousness, intentionality. That is, we can think about things. We have free agency. We can exercise our freedom. And we have an enigmatic nature. Blaise Pascal often talked about humans being great and wretched. We're great. We can do science. We can do philosophy. We can create art. But wretched, human beings are responsible for slavery. Human beings are responsible for the Holocaust. So humans are this enigma of great and wretched. The letter E is ethics. Why are we ethical people? It can account for prescriptive or objective ethics. It can account for ethical duties and values. And then the A is for abstractions. Abstractions are things you cannot see. Things like numbers, propositions, logic, universals, theoretical models. I mean, why is it that scientists can use mathematical equations to understand the natural world? I think all of this points to a mind behind the universe. The fact that math works, the fact that logic works, I think gives us an indication that the world is intelligible, and an intelligible world must come from an intelligent mind. And then finally, religion, C-L-E-A-R, religion. We have a sense of the divine. The vast majority of people who have ever lived on planet Earth worshiped God. Religion is important, even to secular people. They often are looking for an ultimate concern. So our sense of the divine, religious experience, and of course, right at the heart of the New Testament is Jesus, who is a miracle worker, a great teacher, and of course, through his life, death, and resurrection, he redeems sinners from their fallen condition. Well, abductive reasoning is called best explanation reasoning. In science, we might call it IBE, inference to the best explanation. So here's the logical pattern reflected in Christian theistic inference to the best explanation for the world's and life's most meaningful reality. So I'm putting this clear concept into an application of an argument. Premise one, part of my evidence, right? The universe and life exhibit diverse, complex, and meaningful realities. The clear idea. Premise two, the Christian theistic God and worldview revealed in the Bible best explain these realities individually and cumulatively better than naturalism or mysticism. And then my conclusion. My conclusion is, therefore, the Christian theistic God and worldview is the most plausible explanation. So deduction, I want a certain conclusion. Induction, I want a probable conclusion. And abduction, I want the best explanation. Now, when I want to give a talk or write an article or a book that includes a logical argument, I consciously ask myself 5 questions. And so these questions keep in the front of my mind a very careful way of thinking about issues. So these questions serve as a checklist to ensure that I'm on the proper logical track. And I like that. I like to have a checklist. I'd like to be able to keep that in mind as I am reasoning. So let's talk about this checklist. I like to call it the 5 C's of logical persuasion. The 5 C's of logical persuasion. I refer to these questions in just that way. 5 C's of logical persuasion. Now the first C is the word clear, C-L-E-A-R. And so the question that I ask myself whenever I'm going to give a talk, whenever I'm going to present an argument in an article or book form, I ask myself the question, is the claim that I'm defending sufficiently clear? Is the claim, and your claim is always the conclusion you want to prove or you want people to accept. And remember that opinions and beliefs are not arguments. The way you make an opinion and a belief an argument is you support it, you back it up. So an opinion becomes an argument when you give support for holding that opinion or that particular belief. And I think it's absolutely critical to be clear to other people in what you're defending. So the claim or conclusion of my argument is what I'm trying to prove or justify, and therefore what I want people to accept. My conclusion equals my claim, or what I want to prove. Now, why do I focus this way? I try to be crystal clear in setting forth the important central claim. I don't want anybody to be confused as to what I'm trying to persuade them to accept. I want that to be crystal clear. And there is a power that comes with simplicity, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the first C in the 5 C's of persuasive reasoning is the word clear. The second C is concise. Concise. Is my argument adequately concise? Now, being a philosopher and being around a lot of scientists, I've gone to various conferences. I think at times scholars tend to be long-winded. They use a lot of jargon. And that means that usually the only people that understand them are other philosophers or other scientists. But recognize that long-winded arguments often lose both focus and force. If the complexity of your argument overwhelms the simplicity, you're going to have problems. Therefore, I prefer to keep my arguments as succinct and crisp as possible. Stating an argument in its simplest form is often quite powerful. So I don't want anybody to be confused about the conclusion of my argument. I want to persuade them, and I can persuade them by first being clear, and second, by keeping my argument as concise as I can. That doesn't mean it can't be extensive, but keep clarity at the forefront of your mind here. Now, a third C, so we've had clear, we've had concise. My third C is cogent. Is my argument well conceived and well evidenced and therefore logically cogent? And that's the way you want to think about an argument. Have I thought through my argument? Is it well conceived? Do I have plenty and sufficient support for it? Is it well evidenced? That's going to produce a cogent conclusion. So good arguments exhibit careful thought and logical structure. I mentioned before, if you have a healthy mind and healthy brain, you have the capacity to reason. The good Lord has given us these capacities, but a lot of times we're lazy. A lot of times we're sloppy, we're not consistent. Good arguments exhibit careful thought and logical structure. Proper support for the conclusion should be sufficient and logically relevant. That is, you want enough evidence to support your conclusion. That will make it sufficient. And you want it to be logically relevant. You want all of your premises to be pertinent or to be connected to the conclusion. So a cogent argument reflects well-ordered thinking. Again, that's what logic does. It allows us, it teaches us to be careful, to be ordered, and otherwise we can get off the track. We can be lazy, we can be sloppy in the way that we reason. So the first three C's, is it clear? Is it concise? Is it cogent? And our fourth C is the word consider. Consider. Now, why do I use that word? Have I considered the possible counter evidence? You know, what's very interesting, when you present an argument, you want to look at as much of the evidence as you possibly can. Sometimes it's not really possible to know all the evidence for a given argument, but you want to look at much of the evidence as you possibly can. Why is that the case? If you haven't looked at all the evidence, or as much as you can, you've probably not looked at the evidence that goes against your position. And therefore, you haven't looked at all the evidence. So, 4, consider, have I considered the possible counter evidence? Some evidence could serve to weaken or falsify an argument. Careful thinkers should give consideration to their argument's potential weaknesses. Anticipation of possible criticisms of an argument shows intellectual forethought and reflection. The way I like to do that when I teach classes is when I assign an essay or a report to my students, I say, make your argument. But at the end of your paper, I want you to tell me what the very best argument is on the other side. Because, you know, whether we're talking about science or philosophy or history, there's always going to be another perspective, a challenging perspective. Very seldom is there just one view. Get into the habit of asking yourself, what is the best argument against my position? Anticipate it and respond to it. A lot of times we kind of live in a bubble where we have our ideas and our beliefs and our opinions, and we don't step outside to hear maybe the better criticisms that could come from that. Okay, we've looked at 4 of the 5 C's. Is it clear? Is it concise? Is it cogent? Have we considered the relevant counter evidence? And here's our 5th one. Is it compelling? Have I used skillful language? and powerful metaphors that can serve to compel the will of my listeners. You know, when it comes to being compelling, persuasion often involves more than mere logical argument. I want to engage in captivative rhetoric and imaginative stories. They can also serve to help induce the human will to conviction. So you think of Christian authors who have been enormously successful in storytelling. Think of C.S. Lewis, his series, The Chronicles of Narnia. Or think of J.R.R. Tolkien and his Middle-earth, the Lord of the Rings stories. They're able to bring people in by telling stories that are captivating. They're imaginative. There is that imaginative side of reasoning. And so how do I compel people to accept the conclusion that I want? A great benefit of studying logic is that it serves to order a person's thinking. So I want to say it again. I'll bet you have a good mind and a good brain, and therefore you know how to reason. What logic can come along is make you more consistent in your reasoning. It can make you more connected to your reasoning. Now, order helps to protect a person from crooked or fallacious reasoning. So you can make mistakes in reasoning. We call those logical fallacies. And there are numerous fallacies that we discover and talk about in our book. But a fallacy is when an argument breaks down, and it can break down in a variety of ways. So let's summarize again. The 5 C's of persuasion help ensure that valued order. And so my checklist is always, number 1, is my argument clear? Is my conclusion clear? Is my argument concise? Is my conclusion concise? Is my argument and conclusion cogent, well evidenced, and solid, having internal consistency, if you will? Number 4, has my argument and my conclusion, have I considered the counter evidence? Get in the habit of asking yourself, what's a good argument against mine? And you're going to discover that when you talk to people about your faith and you want to share your faith, people are going to have questions or objections. It's always good to know what those are potentially like so that you can respond to them. So clear, concise, cogent, consider, and compelling. Those are my 5 C's of persuasion. I commend them to you. It's helpful for me. It's helpful for me to remember them. And again, I utilize them anytime I give a presentation, or I write an article, or I write a book. I fall back on these. Now, logic serves as a valuable tool that can help a person discover the truth. Well, that is a mouthful. If logic is a tool that can help you and I discover truth, that's an incredibly valuable tool. And so I believe that logic and the study of logic is consistent with the existence of God. God made us in His image. Part of that image is our capacity to reason and to think. And I believe that abstract realities like mathematics and logic, that comes from a mind. So God created the world using His nomos and logos. Nomos, His laws; logos, His logic. He imbued those into creation. He then created us, His creatures, in His image, and He networked us together. I think the Christian worldview is able to explain the most important ideas that come into the world. So the study of logic can help us to apprehend truth, and God is truth. Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Now here's a quotation by C.S. Lewis, one of the great communicators of the 20th century, one of the great authors. C.S. Lewis says this, and it comes back to the idea of clear thinking. Lewis says, "I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. So my goal as a Christian scholar, as a Christian apologist, is I want my work to be characterized by two things. I want my arguments to be substantive, but I also want those arguments to be accessible. I want scholars to recognize that I've touched on all the correct areas, but I want people that are not professional philosophers, who are not professional scholars, to benefit from this. And when I've taught Sunday school over the years, I've had people with advanced degrees in the class, along with high school graduates, along with young people. And I've always taken it as a very important challenge to present substantive arguments, but to present them in an accessible way. There is something very powerful about clarity. It carries its own persuasion. Now, let me touch on one other area, because we've talked about reason, but I want to talk a little bit about rhetoric. Rhetoric is the language of persuasion. How do I go about persuading people? And interestingly enough, Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, his dates are 384 to 322 BC. He was one of the world's most influential philosophers. His profound ideas deeply influenced many areas of human thought. And he wrote what many consider to not only be the greatest work concerning persuasion in his treatise on rhetoric, but Aristotle is the author of a book on logic. He's also the author of a book on rhetoric. Aristotle describes three modes of persuasion revealed in three key Greek terms. He talks about ethos, logos, and pathos. So allow me now to explain how these three principles of persuasion can be appropriately utilized in legitimate attempts to influence people. So let's look at those. Aristotle said if you want to persuade someone, you need ethos, you need pathos, and you need logos. Now, what is ethos? That's persuasion based upon character. If I'm presenting an argument to you, you may be asking yourself, can I trust this person? Is this a person I can give consideration to and I can open my mind and heart to this? So it's very important that you have credibility. That's really what Aristotle is saying. The author of an argument needs to be a credible person. If I'm a scientist, I need to be careful in my thinking about the sciences. If I'm a philosopher, I need to be careful about my thinking in philosophy. Whether it is theology or Bible, people want to know, is this a credible person? So you want to present yourself and you want to develop that kind of character. Now, number two is pathos. Persuasion based upon emotion. We get words like empathy and sympathy here. And this is where you recognize that people are persuaded not just by logical arguments, but by getting them to think in imaginative terms. Emotion. Emotion is not a bad thing. God made us this way. And we want to connect people, not just in the mind, but also in the heart, so to speak. And then thirdly, he talks about logos, which is the Greek word behind the English word logic. In fact, if you read John 1:1, John says, in the beginning was the Word, the logos. And the logos, or word, was with God, and the word, or logos, was God. It's amazing that John recognized that Jesus is the thought of God. He is the logic of God. He is the voice of God. He is God come in human flesh. So when it comes to the rhetorical triangle, we want to have ethos, which is credibility. We want to have pathos, which relates to the emotion. That gets people in that recognition that this is really important. And we want logos. If you argue without logos, you're never going to be ultimately persuaded, but you always want to combine with logos, ethos, and pathos. So let me talk just a bit with you about our new book, Clear Thinking in a Messy World. The subtitle of this book is A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. And what do we mean by clear thinking in a messy world? Well, there are areas of life that can really kind of confuse us. Some of the messiness in a world are things like logical fallacies. There are things like conspiracy thinking, propaganda. All of these things are ways in which our thinking can be confused, or it can be warped, so to speak. So our ultimate goal in this book was to write a book for Christians. It is, after all, a Christian guide, to help Christians recognize that they can trust in Scripture, because in the Old Testament we're told that wisdom, or education, begins with honoring God. And I believe that a classical liberal education, which is characteristic of many parts of the educated world, really comes out of a biblical context. And so we want to be clear thinkers. We want to be able to think through challenging topics. And there are plenty of those topics today that leave us very challenged. So this is a book that Christians can read. It is also a book that uses Christian apologetic examples. So not only will you be learning about the laws of logic and how to put an argument together, and premises and conclusions and inferences, but you'll also get examples that will relate to defending the faith and challenging in those particular areas. I think a very unique part of our book, and I'm very proud of this comes from my colleague, my friend Mark Perez, who not only is an administrator at Reasons to Believe, but he's also a philosopher of science. And Mark has a very important part of this book. It is cognitive biases. You know, all of us as finite creatures, and all of us as fallen creatures, you know, if you think about the Christian worldview, where you have creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Well, as fallen creatures and limited creatures, it's easy for us to be biased. It's easy for us to be prejudicial, not only in our actions, but in our ways of thinking. And what Mark does so well in this book is he mentions some of the cognitive biases. Let me mention just one to you. One of them is this idea that you go looking for confirmation of your arguments. And that's natural. I mean, I want to prove this. I want to find evidence for this. But the bias, the confirmation bias, is when you only look at the evidence that supports your view and you ignore evidence that contradicts your view. So it is easy to simply go looking for what supports your position, to ignore counter evidence. And Mark mentions a number of these cognitive biases that get in the way. So the good Lord has given us many gifts, and one of the great gifts is having a healthy brain, a healthy mind. We're made in God's image. We are capable of reasoning. Many of the people who have made deep contributions to the field of logic were Christian. So this is in our blood, so to speak. We are people of the book. We are people of reasoning and rationality. And what the study of logic can do is, again, make our thinking ordered. Rather than being sloppy, rather than having kind of crooked reasoning, we can reason in a rational way. And so this book, I think, can be very helpful to you. And again, it will guide you not just in logic, but also will help you in the particular field of apologetics, which is to give a reasoned defense of the faith. And then finally, It will help you in terms of recognizing the flaws and the difficulties that we have in our life. So again, it is entitled Clear Thinking in a Messy World, subtitle A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. I'm Ken Samples, and it's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.